All right, I've never met Brett, so I probably should not introduce him.
Well, my next slide, I'll introduce myself.
Oh, you're making it too easy for Justin.
Yeah, see, you got everything here.
Well, welcome everyone to this month's edition of the North Dallas Developers Group. This month, we have Brett Jones, who Justin is going to introduce properly. Brett Jones is going to talk about Ansible tonight. Take it away, Justin.
All right, today we have Brett Jones, as previously mentioned by David Penton. Take it away, Brett Jones.
Hey, I'm Brett Jones. I'm going to be talking about use cases for Ansible, and I guess I'll get started. First, talk about myself. I'm a staff software engineer and architect at InVision. I work on a bunch of different things, primarily on Linux, open source, platform architecture, Kubernetes, everything listed here. Specifically passionate about automation, developer workflows, testing, things like that. When I'm not sitting at my computer, father, husband, and amateur philosopher. So what I do at InVision, or I guess I should kind of talk about what I do today. I work at InVision. We have a freehand platform, which is like a whiteboard online collaborative platform that helps people work together. So I guess we'll jump right into it. Ansible is it's kind of a set of tools that allows you to present desired state as readable and executable instructions. A lot of times Ansible is compared to, I guess, as a false dichotomy with Terraform. I think Terraform and Ansible play hand in hand together, where Terraform is, in my case, I usually use both of them at the same time. Where Terraform I would use to create the infrastructure, all of the hardware, or I guess VMs and everything like that. And where Ansible I would use to to configure all of the operating systems and everything, all the communication between the services. So Ansible is kind of in the same group. It's infrastructure as code. What that means is that you can take instructions and they can be repeatable. You can recreate just running a single command, and then it will do the same thing over and over. Ansible is idempotent. Typically, sometimes you can write it in ways that it's not, but for the most part, it's you can run it over and over again on the same hosts, and it's not going to make any changes that aren't really necessary. It's centralized because all of your code that describes your desired state or what should be your current state exists in a single repository. It's consistent because there are patterns that you can use to do certain things, like creating files, installing packages, modifying files, and so on and so forth. And you do them in a consistent way rather than with some kind of bespoke bash scripts or whatever language you're working in. It's readable because it's YAML. I know that's not always the case with YAML, but for example, things like, you look at some like GitHub Actions or something like that, it tends to be readable, but then you can go far away into something like Concourse or something like that, where it's a YAML, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. You can read it, but it doesn't mean anything to you. But I feel like Ansible is a lot different than that, where you can read it and you can understand pretty quickly what the instruction really means. One of the big things about it is well documented. Ansible has a ton of documentation. If you feel like you have the question, I want to know if Ansible can do this, you can usually Google it and you're going to land on an Ansible documentation that not only tells you you can do it, but it'll give you the exact instructions on how to do it. You can break down instructions into components. You can import and reuse those components across all of your code. And a lot of the playbooks are shareable. So there's Ansible Galaxy, which people upload specific playbooks and roles that do common things like install Docker or set up monitoring. And you can import these into your local library like you would any kind of vendor. And then you can just one line add in and say, run this thing from this other place that I've downloaded from online. And it's powerful. I've been using it consistently, both personally and professionally, for 3 years, and I've not found anything that it couldn't do. I've been in a couple situations where I thought, I don't know how this is going to work, but I've Googled it and I've worked through it, and I've gotten it to work in a way that makes sense. And then it's testable because even with your instructions, you can write Ansible tests to check your instructions and make sure that they're doing precisely what you want them to do. So Ansible is kind of laid out similar to what you would see with a Terraform, if you're familiar with that. You have your management node, which that's where you're going to be executing all of your playbooks from. And that's where you keep all of your playbooks, your inventory, and everything else. And then you reach out and execute commands remotely on machines wherever they live. So basically, what you're trying to get to with Ansible is you want to take something like this, where you have a very clear instruction, and then you want to apply it to a machine, and then you'll end up with something like this. So first I want to kind of talk about the fundamentals of Ansible. First you have your inventory. Your inventory is what describes your, basically your inventory of all of your infrastructure. You have your playbooks, which is your execution tasks. Playbooks are kind of the base thing that executes everything else. Your playbooks contain everything, all of the other instructions within them. You have files, which I don't mean that in the literal term. I mean that in Ansible, you have static files that exist in your inventory. They get copied to machines, so they can be static config files or images or anything like that. You have templates. I think this is probably where Ansible becomes the most powerful, because instead of copying static files, you can use the Jinja 2 template language, which is pretty clear in the way that you write it. It's extremely powerful. It's one of those things that has a ton of features that you start off with the basics and you realize how useful it is, and as you go along, you start seeing how very powerful it is, because you almost have the whole Python language at your disposal when you're writing Jinja templates. Tasks, like I talked about before, it's like a task is a single instruction. Roles, which a role is a group of playbooks. So a role can be like a Docker. So your role is Docker. If you designate a machine as a Docker role, then that means that you want Docker installed and running on that machine, and that role can be associated with several playbooks, files, templates, and everything else. And then you have obviously, like you do anything else, you have variables that can be defined either at the group level, the host level, or they can be defined in the playbooks themselves. The folder structure is kind of open. I say kind of because it has some fundamental things a couple principles that you can rely on, but you can lay it out kind of any way you want to. It's similar to Terraform in that fashion, that it has a couple things that you want to stick to, but for the most part, it's up to you how you lay everything out. But they do have some recommendations on their website and introductory sites to get you started. So whenever you're writing Ansible, your current directory is meaningful, same as Terraform. Whatever you're executing, it's going to be looking at your current directory if you have any associated files, and it's going to know that those are related to what you're working on. So you can separate things by environment. You can have a production folder or a staging folder, and when you go into that directory, it's going to just be looking in that directory. Just for the demo, I'm going to be using a flat, well, not really flat, but flat-ish structure, just because I want to keep from getting things too complicated. What's going to happen is I'll kind of point out where things will get a little messy if you continue with the flat structure, and it'll become kind of obvious. So I would say go through the folder structures, figure out which fits best for you, start flat, and then start organizing things after. That's what I've done, and I've been pretty successful with it. So first, I want to talk about the inventory. This is kind of the what gets you started in Ansible. The inventory is what talks about all of your machines that you're going to be working with. It defines all of your machines, your MAC addresses, anything that you want to be using in your tasks when you're executing. You can define the arbitrary keys and values to any inventory you want to. You can group inventory. You can leave things ungrouped. You can tag them. And your inventory doesn't have to be something static that you define. You can have a script that will execute that Ansible will look at. So you point at Ansible at a script and say, execute this script to get my inventory. And so when you execute any Ansible commands, it's going to run this execution script and it will gather your inventory using that. You can write a bash script. There are several plugins online that will give you your AWS inventory pretty quickly, or GCP, Azure, anything like that. There's a lot more I can show later, but there's documentation on that. So this is a kind of an example of an inventory. This is a flat INI structure. This is what I tend to use because it's easy to read, I think. Everything's on one line, so every line you see is specifically to that. So your mail server would be at this IP address using this user. This is a group, so you see the square brackets defines your group. So my web servers would be Nginx1 and Nginx2 at these, and then all of the variables apply to them. So as you can see under web servers, I've defined an arbitrary variable called max request per second on the Nginx1 server. So if we say that one's not very powerful, we're gonna make sure it can't control too much. I'm just sticking an arbitrary variable on it, and I can use that anywhere in the instructions. And then on line 12, you can see I define kind of the global variables for all of my web servers. So if I have 15 of these, I'm gonna say most of them can handle 500 requests per second, but this one is gonna be, but Nginx1 can only handle about 200. And then again, you can see more example on the bottom where I have my DNS servers grouped together. So now going to talk about what the playbooks are. It's similar to what you would do in most things. It's basically the instructions. The playbooks contain all of your instructions from end to end. It's got the tasks, the roles, variables, everything you need to execute what you're trying to do. That could be install Docker or create a database. Anything that you want to do from end to end, it's going to have all the instructions to do that. Everything in a playbook is executed in serial. However, they're listed in the YAML file is how they're executed in that order. Now, there are caveats to that, like you can create handlers or notifiers that will execute at the very end. That's for the triggering events that you want. Like if you're going to do a bunch of stuff with a systemd config files and you want to trigger a reload at the very end, you can notify that and it will push that until the very end. So you only do it one time. And the tasks, like I said, are the individual instructions. They contain some pretty basic things like the name, the module that you want to do, module options, and then the state. So the state is kind of the thing that goes along with all of the tasks. You create your task with a name. You just arbitrarily describe what it's going to do. You give it your task options, and then you have your module name and your state, and then your module options. So an example of that would be like this one I have here. I'm going to install Nginx. That's what I'm doing. I'm using the package module. The state I want it to be in. Actually, sorry, it's not supposed to be installed. It's supposed to be present. And then the name of the package I'm using is Nginx. The second one is another example. There's in this case, a systemd service called Nginx. I want it to be started, and the other flag I'm using is enabled. So this is similar to what you would do if you're executing the command directly, the systemd command. You want to start it, and you want to make sure it's enabled, which in systemd just means it's going to start at system start. So a couple examples I can kind of just briefly walk through. Doing like an apt-get install or a DNF install or yum or whatever package manager your machine is using, all translate to the same instruction, and that's just a package module, state present, and the name of the package, in this case, Nginx. And that will execute on any flavor of Linux using whatever package manager that is default. Another example is kind of contrived, but it gives you the idea that you want to create a file named foobar on the root folder with the content of hello world. In this case, you can use the copy module, and at first it seems kind of unintuitive, but the copy module is what you want to execute when you want to run. You want to copy anything from the guest machine, which is whatever you're executing from, onto the host machine, which is where you're executing the code. So you're gonna copy to the destination this content. This is a little bit more of a I guess an advanced instruction. So I just want to give kind of the idea of what it means to do it in Ansible versus, I don't know, Bash. So if we say we have a VSFTP configuration file, the way that you enable that is you ensure that the line listen equals yes is in that file. However, there are a bunch of instructions already in that file by default. Once you install it, it could say listen, no, never, always. It could be anything. It could be commented anything. So typically, you might want to do that with Stream Editor. You create a backup file, replace listen equals whatever with listen equals yes in the FTP directory. Now the problem with that is that this is not idempotent. It's going to touch the file regardless. It's going to change the file every time you execute it. You won't really know when the last time it was actually modified. And the one difficult part of this is it does not insert listen equals yes if it does not already exist in this file. So you're going to have another line that says, if that doesn't work, then insert it at the end of the file. Well, Ansible has a module for that called line in file. You're going to give it a path. You're going to say, look for the first match. You're going to tell it to back up the file. So don't just overwrite the file because you could mess something up badly. So it's going to create a backup of the file, which is what this set I does. The line that you want to insert is listen equals yes. The regex you want to place is listen equals whatever. Your state is present, which means that you want this line to exist. And then you're going to make sure that if it does have to be inserted, that it's going to be inserted before the end of file, which really just means just put it at the bottom of the file if you can't find it anywhere else. So I'm going to start with I'm going to do kind of a demo on this. I'm going to give like a business case for this, an example that I've used in the past. Say we started a new job. They said, hey, we've got 52 machines. I can tell you their IPs. They're not monitored. I don't know how to monitor them, but we need them all to start pushing metrics into our existing monitoring system. Sounds great. That's 52 machines. That's a lot to do. We can write a bash script to start pushing stuff to it, but that gets kind of hairy when some of them don't work and some of them are different operating systems and so on and so forth. For the sake of this example, I'm going to use Telegraph. It's one of my favorite tools. It works really well in everything I've used it for. I think I already put that in there. Yeah. So Telegraph's pretty straightforward. It's going to pull metrics off of the machines, and then it's going to write them to a remote endpoint. Now what I've done is I've actually written I have started this guy. So I've created a Grafana Cloud instance just to kind of make this easy for myself. So Grafana Cloud, it's just going to let me start writing metrics to it. So my goal, I'm just going to pretend like this is the dashboard that's already been created, and I have these 52 machines that I need to start monitoring. I don't have 52 VMs, nor do I have space for it on my machine. So I have 3, and we're just going to pretend like it's 52. Great. So to start off, I just created a vagrant file, which is giving me my machines. There should be 3 or 4 machines, I don't remember. So ignore the Prometheus one. We've got 3 machines here. and I've got the IP addresses of them all. And then I'm just going to start with that list. That's not it. Right. So I'm going to say that the person who asked us to do this job has given us this list of IP addresses. These are IP addresses of the 3 machines that we have, and they told us that this is the this is the URL that we need to push metrics to in Prometheus format, and this is my authentication information here. So the way I'm going to start with that is these machines don't have anything to do with Telegraph on them. They're just for this instance, they're just running Nginx for some web purposes. So I'm going to start off with going to Telegraph, go to the installation instructions. So this is what you're normally going to run into, and I know everyone's seen this before. You copy and you paste this into a terminal and then hope that nobody's running some shady code in your terminal. But instead of just doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this instructions into Ansible. That way we can make sure that we can do it consistently and over again. So let me copy this instructions, and then I'm going to, this is the way that I normally do it. I usually copy my instructions and then I write them in Ansible in a playbook like this, and then I just copy them down into whatever instructions that needs. But the first thing we have to do is we have to create our inventory file, because for now Ansible has no idea what we're using or what we're going to be executing against. Vagrant does some neat trickery with this, so it actually creates the inventory for you. But for the sake of the demo, I'm going to create the inventory myself. We're going to just create a group called web servers. I'm going to call them 3 and 4. 3 and 4. So this is my inventory file. It's pretty straightforward. So I kind of want to show you, just as an example, what that gives me. One of the tools that you can do with Ansible is you can execute arbitrary commands on the machines. It's not something you want to do to change any kind of state or mutate anything on the machines themselves, but it's very helpful if you want to check on the machines as a whole. Like, say, is Nginx running on all of these machines? That's one thing you can do with the Ansible. So you're going to tell it you want to use the raw module, and then the arguments you're going to get it. The raw module will just let you execute arbitrary bash commands. So I'm going to say which Nginx. Oh, that's using Brett. So Ansible is trying to use my regular username, which is not what I want it to do. So this is another part of the inventory. What you're going to have to do is, as part of this, you can say, define the variables for this group. And one of I didn't explain it before, but Ansible host is the name that you use to describe the way that it's going to access it. Ansible host is just a known key. Another known key is Ansible user root. So what this block does is it defines variables for the entire web servers group, and I'm going to set the user as root for the entire group. And so now I'm going to run this again, and it should use the root user. So you can see here that it executed on all of my servers. It doesn't do it in any specific order, but you can see the response to which Nginx is the same on each machine. So I know Nginx at least exists on all of these machines. So you could do anything like host name, check anything you want to check on these machines. I use this a lot to check to see if there's something that's already there, if I need to work with it, or like, for example, what the host name is and stuff like that. So that's the inventory. The inventory is created. Now what we can do is we can actually refer to that inventory inside of this file. this is the full playbook. So all playbooks start with a definition of your hosts. In this case, we're going to do it on all of the web servers. So this is a group name. Sorry, I'm updating my instructions. Become. This is a sorry. There's another instruction that you use on the playbook, which tells it there's a whole list of stuff you could read on what become means in Ansible. But what it means is, do you want to change into the root user, either via sudo or su or however you want to do it. Usually, if I'm doing something that requires root access, I put become true. I know I specify that I'm using the root user, but I'm still going to put become true just to make it explicit that I need the root user to execute these things. So let's start first with the instructions. The first set of instructions, we want to install this key into this file. So this is a normal practice for anyone who's familiar with Ubuntu, is you're installing a repository encryption key. So there's actually already an instruction in Ansible to do this called apt key. You want that key to be present. You want it to pull that key from a URL. So I'm going to take this URL and paste it here. And then you want I think that's all you need there. Yeah. So this is going to take this and install it into the apt key repository. You can specify the file name here, but I'm not going to worry about it because we don't actually care as long as it's installed. So one of the things that the instructions want you to do is they want you to check your operating system information, and that has to be part of your app source. So it's important whether or not you're running Ubuntu or Debian or something else, because this app source is going to give you a different package depending on what you're running. So we don't actually want to do this in Ansible because there are tools to do that for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the app repository. And again, there's already a package for this. And so what we're going to do is we want to specify the repo as this. But instead of using these tokenized variables, which you pulled out of the SEOS release, we're going to use something that Ansible provides for you, and that are the Ansible facts. And so I'll explain that real quick. Web one. Whoops. So what Ansible does is it actually caches a bunch of information about the machines themselves. And what it does with that is it puts it in this Ansible fact cache directory. So you have all of these servers in here, and it's going to store a big JSON blob of information about every machine. And you can kind of see all the information it gathers about each individual machine. It's got the blocks. You can look at its LSB information, which is what we're going to be looking at here in a second. You got all of your IP address information. A ton of extra information. It kind of goes on and on about all it can gather, MAC addresses, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of information in here. It's really, really useful for you. If you need to know anything about the machine, it's likely that Ansible already gathered that as a piece of information. So to demonstrate that point, one thing that we get out of that is the Ansible LSB. So Ansible LSB is actually going to give us the ID that this is talking about. And so that ID actually comes from SEOS release. And I'll show you that real quick. If you're unfamiliar with this, it's pretty much on every operating system as of late, and it just gives you this basic information about the current operating system. So what we want to do is we want to get this ID out of here, but we want to get it in the Ansible way and not just a file that may or may not exist on the system, because there are Linux systems that do not have that OS release file. So using the Ansible variable, Ansible LSB ID, we're going to shove that in there rather than pulling it out of that file. And then the code name is also in that Ansible LSB code name. And I do a lower because sometimes they're uppercase depending on the operating system. So this right here is kind of the power of the Jinja templating language I was talking about. You can inject arbitrary values into most of your templates. So any kind of your facts or variables or anything that you've gathered are accessible within these templates here. We want it to be present, and we want to put it in this file.
Hey, Brett, what does the state present mean again?
So your state defines what you want the task to do. So you can change this to absent, and now it's going to make sure that this does not exist. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So if I want to delete this repository, I could take that out, put state absent this file. Present is actually implied, so technically you can take these off to make it simpler. I like to be explicit. It also helps me later if I want to change this to something else. It can also, state can also mean many different things depending on the module you're using. So for example, like a Docker container state can be restarted, or systemd unit can be reloaded. The state is reloaded or restarted or enabled, or things like that. So these are the first two instructions. We want to install the app key. We want to add the repository into this app source file. The next thing we want to do is install Telegraph. So some of the instructions are to do an apt-get update, which is automatically done by this apt repository, and technically it's done by most recent versions that we're going to anyway. So we're not going to worry about doing an apt update. It's part of the apt repository module. It does it automatically. The next thing we're going to do is install a package. So we're going to use the package module. The name of the package we're going to install is Telegraph. And then again, we want that state to be present. Anyone have any questions about this briefly? Nothing?
No questions in the chat.
Cool.
Makes sense to me.
Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute that playbook. And what this is going to do is it's going to take the instructions and it's going to apply it to the whole web. Oh, yeah, I misspelled that. Web servers. So as you'll see, it's going to start executing it on all of the machines. And then it's going to tell us the outcome of that. You can pass the V flag up to anywhere between 1 to 5 times if you want to get verbose and more verbose output. You can also do a diff. It'll tell you what it changed explicitly. In this case, keep it simple. We're pretty sure we're going to know this. I'm going to execute it again just to kind of show you that it's idempotent and it's not going to do anything that's not already done. So we can do this multiple times over and over. Everything's already done. One of the things it does with every task is it makes sure that that has not already been done. And if it has, it just says okay. So that's the difference you're going to see between okay and then this yellow changed. One thing that will happen is if, let's say, web server 4 failed on the install process, everything continues for every other node in the group except for web 4. Web 4 will stop execution of everything else, but everything else continues. And then you're going to get that recap out here that one thing failed and web 4 stopped where it was. So I'm going to check, verify I'm at work. So I'm going to execute Ansible on all the web servers. I'm going to use the module. I'm going to just use the raw module this time, and I'm going to say which Telegraph. So now we can see Telegraph's been installed on every machine, along with the app key and everything else we want to do. So next thing we're going to do, we've got Telegraph installed. All great. It's not doing anything. It's not running. It doesn't execute or anything like that. What we're going to do is we're going to start getting into scrape metrics and then write them out to Prometheus or Fire. So the next thing we want to do, we want to create the Telegraph user because we don't want to run this as production or as as root. So we're going to use the user module. It is what it sounds like it is. We're going to create the user Telegraph. We're going to not create a home. Now, all these flags are documented. I'm kind of going through them quickly because I just want to get to the point. But if you go on Ansible docs, for example, you look at the user, and I'll show you that. I just want to briefly show that real quick. So this is what you'll find all over the Ansible docs. You're going to find this is the user module. And you've got synopsis, examples, how to use it, return values, and it describes every single parameter that you need to know and what you can provide, what choices you have. Are they Boolean? Are they paths? Does it have to exist? And then you scroll down to the most useful part of all of Ansible documentation, data the examples. So they will tell you add John D to specific UID to primary group admin. This is the instructions for it, and so on and so forth. I'm skipping through this because I already know a lot of these by heart because I've done them 100 times. That, and I also have I've done this one specifically, so I've got it quite memorized. So I'm going to jump back in, and then I'll kind of continue on. So part of creating a user, we don't want to create a home directory. The home directory we're gonna assign to it is etctelegraph. I know we said we don't want to create that. We're just going to create it ourselves. We don't want it to be able to execute anything, so we're going to say that its shell has been false. So if anybody tries to log in as a Telegraph user, they can't because it can't open a TTY. Obviously, we want it to be present. It's not a system user, and we're going to give it the UID of 997 so that we can be consistent. I'm going to break there for a second, and I'm going to execute my playbook again, and we're going to run through the same process. All's good, everything's already installed. The user already exists. So we don't have to actually create the user. It looks like installing Telegraph creates that user for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that instruction out of there because we know that installing Telegraph actually creates the user for us. Next thing we want to do is we're going to create the configuration directory. The way that Telegraph works is you have a telegraph.d directory, and you drop all of your configuration files in it, and then Telegraph loads them all out. So you can split it all out into different functionality per file, and Telegraph reads it all out, and then that just instructs it on how to scrape metrics off of the machine. It's not super important to this, but I wanted to talk about that. So we're going to use the file module. And this is where we get a little bit different because the state in this case, if you're familiar with the Linux operating system, or the POSIX at all, everything that exists on the operating system is a file. It doesn't matter if it's a directory or anything else, it's a file. It's a file descriptor for that matter. A file descriptor can be a directory. So in this case, Ansible is very explicit about that. You're creating a file, and the state of that file is that it is a directory. So technically speaking, that's what you're looking for. When you're first starting Ansible, it gets kind of confusing because you're wanting to create a directory module, but that's not necessarily how it works. The path that you want to create is the Telegraph.d configuration directory, because this is where we're going to drop all of our files in. It's always a good rule of thumb to create your group and your owner and the mode. So we're going to say the user can read, write, execute. The group can read, execute, and everyone else can read and execute. You can do this in any way, any format you want to. I like to do this because it's quicker to read than doing like a 0, 7, what's it, 24, can't remember. So that's it. That'll create the directory. After that, we want to tell it the input. So Telegraph, you give it some instructions that says, take these instructions. You tell Telegraph, this is what the kind of metrics I want you to pull off the machine, and those are just called inputs. So we're going to create a configuration file on the machine, and then we're going to drop it in that directory that we just created above. So we're going to use a template, and I'll explain why we're going to do that in a second. So a template basically is the same thing as like a copy module, but instead of a static file, we're going to use the inputs configuration file that's a Jinja 2 template. So inside that file, we can actually put Jinja templating like we have a line, or this line here. We can put Jinja templating inside of the file before it gets copied onto the machine. So we're going to create the inputs configuration file based on this template file. Again, we're going to actually copy all of this because it's the exact same telegraph mode. And this is actually just rewrite. So far, so good. I'm going to execute the playbook again just to make sure all is well. Oh, okay. So what we have here is I try to create the telegraph inputs. That template file does not exist, and that's by design because we're going to have to create that. I'm going to copy it because it's pretty straightforward. So when you're executing creating templates, Ansible looks for a local directory called templates, and inside of that directory is what you're referring to. So in our case, it was inputs.jt. Nope. So I'm going to copy and paste this because it's very much not the topic of this conversation, but I just want to point out the Jinja templating here. Everything else is static. It's just something that I've configured for this use case. However, the host name is our host name. We have to set that in this file, and since it's unknown and it's different per host, we're going to put a Jinja token in here, which is inventory host name, and that's one of those other facts that you'll learn over time of using Ansible. It's just a variable that you always have accessible to you. So I'm going to drop this config in this file, and now this inputs config should exist. So now when I run this again, it should pick that config file up and then drop it onto the Ansible configuration directory. Oh, I'm sorry. I was wrong. It's not looking in the root directory. It's looking in the playbooks directory, which is where the file exists. There we go. So again, we're going to say we're going to make sure that file's there, just to prove the point. The inputs configuration file is there, and actually, what we can do is grab the host name out of it, and as you see, the host name is printed as it should be in every single. So that's the host, and that's actually the file that's on the host. Pretty straightforward. Any questions so far? Great.
None yet.
All right. So next up, what we got to do is the second part of the telegraph is the outputs. So telegraph, like I said, it can take any kind of input. I say any is just a little set list, but it takes inputs and it has outputs. It can do anything in between that, but essentially what we're using it for is we got inputs, which are the machine metrics, and outputs, which is going to be writing Prometheus format metrics to our Grafana instance. So this is going to be basically the same thing that we did here with the templates. So we're going to copy this, and we're going to say outputs file owned by Telegraph, also read write. Now we're going to have to create that outputs file again. So this is now instead the outputs file. Again, I'm going to copy and paste this because the format of it's irrelevant. But I do want to point out here that we need some information for this. So because Grafana, because we're using a, yes. Sorry. It's in the templates directory, so there we go. We need the username, the password, and the push URL. Now we don't want to just stick that in this file. We could, it would be easy, I guess, here. But if we change that later on, we're gonna have that, everywhere, all over the place. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna put it in a variable file, and the username and password I'm gonna put in a secret file using something called Ansible Vault, not to be confused with HashiCorp Vault. So these things do not exist anywhere. I'm going to, I guess, make them. So group vars, the name of our group was web servers. I'm going to create a file in here called vault. So I think it can be a 3. Anyway, you create a group vars folder. This is another standard Ansible practice. You got a group vars folder. Inside that folder, you have the name of your group, and inside of that folder, you have any YAML file. It's going to load all the YAML files in there, and it's going to apply all of those YAML defined variables to your to all the hosts in that group. So I'm just going to put a password on it, and then this is going to be a YAML file. So forgive me, I'm going to actually no, I don't need to do that.
Hey,
So-
sorry, real quick, Brett.
Sure.
Where does that vault live? Is that living on your personal machine? Is that specific to this directory? Is it?
So in this case, it is just using the password that I typed into AES encrypt the file. So you can see the file is just an AES 256 encrypted file. So I'm going to show you how.
And that's just local on your machine in that directory?
Yeah, so that's encrypted with my passphrase that I just typed in. So anybody who wanted to use this would have to know that passphrase. So in this instance, it's not useful for like a large team, a large set of teams, unless you integrated this with something else. But for like personal projects, this right here is just using a literal passphrase that you type in whenever you want to edit that. So for example, if I want to edit that file now, it asks me the password. And if I don't know it, it's going to say, sorry, you can't even read that file. So type in the password and then I have access to the file. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I'm going to go back to the Telegraph. I have all of the data here in my instructions. I want to put it in the right format. So the way that I wrote that is I have a Grafana cloud with a .push URL, a username, and a password. Excuse me. A Grafana cloud, a URL, a username, and a password. So this username I'm going to put here. Password I'll put here. This is just YAML format. And then the URL. So just creating a YAML file with that information. Now these variables get defined on any, like I said, any machine that is part of this web servers group is going to automatically have those variables accessible to them inside the playbooks. So when it executes this template, it's going to say, give me the Grafana Cloud push URL. Now, if this runs on a host that it's not in that group, the playbook's going to say, I don't have that variable. I don't know what to do. So it'll back out. So that's going to create that file. I'm going to run the playbook again, just to kind of make sure. Oh, right. So this is what kind of what the question you asked me. It's saying that I don't know how to decrypt the vault secrets file that I found in that group vars file. What you can do is you can integrate that with other things, so you don't have to type the password every time. But for this case, I'm just going to pass the ask vault pass flag, and it's just going to ask me the password. And now it's decrypted, and it's using those variables that are hidden away. So I can commit this to a Git repository or anything else. Push URL. So I didn't get it wrong. So you can see the variable is saying there's no push URL defined on that. Now what you can do is you can pass the VB flag and it'll tell you exactly what line of code in the YAML file that ran on. So I'm going to do that this time just so you can see what I'm talking about. So you see these lines here, it'll tell you what it's executing, what line of the YAML it is. This is your stack trace, Justin. So now you can see here, it created the file on that folder. So oops. Oh, that's because it can spell. Right. So same thing. Created the file. Oops. Oh, it failed, which is the, hold on. I'm just gonna cat the file. Yeah, so now you can see every single one of them has exactly the thing that I expected it to write. So next instruction for telegraph, we're going to, we've created the output file. So now what we're going to do, in this point, telegraph is basically ready to start writing, to start reading and writing those configuration files. One thing, this is kind of a caveat to Ansible. The config file that it comes with has some instructions in it, so I'm going to make sure that I don't want any of the default config messing up the configs that I just wrote. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a copy. I'm going to copy to that file. I want to empty out this file, essentially. I don't want to delete it because it'll complain, tell another caveat of telegraph, it'll say there's no config file, I don't want to. So I'm going to copy this. This is kind of repetitive, but the destination, and then the content I want in that file is nothing. So telegraph will say there's a config file, there's nothing in it. I'm just going to read the other config files and try it out. Now I want to run the service on system D in this case because it's their Ubuntu machines. What I'm going to do is create this template file. This is going to be the etcd. This is going to be the systemd template. I'm going to create a telegraph.service file using Jinja template because I'm going to put something custom inside of it. So this is where the telegraph file lives on by default on the systems. I'm actually just going to override the default one to put these in etc systemd. And then again, owner group and mode. In this case, we're going to make this the root user because because root is the one that executing the service. Now we have that there. What we want to do is we want to enable and start telegraph. The systemd service is basically that we just created. And so we're going to be using a different module this time. You can probably guess it. It's the service module. There is a systemd module, but it is specific to systemd, as you would expect. The service module is not specific. It will work with an id or sysb configure, whatever you have on the system. I try to use this one whenever I can, unless I explicitly have to use the systemd, and then you kind of create like if templates inside of your playbooks. But to keep it simple, we're going to use the service one. Say the name of the service is telegraph. We want it to be started, and enabled is a flag on systemd that says you want it to run when the system starts. So the system is going to be enabled, and it's also going to be in the state of start. So I'm going to run that playbook again. Could not find or access the telegraph service config. So back to the same thing. We have to create our telegraph service. So this file, I'm going to actually save it. Oops. What was it called? I'm going to copy this. It's pretty standard stuff. So what I'm doing here, one thing you can do is this directory here. This is what I'm going to show you. We have this config directory here that's very specific. Now, what happens is if we change that directory that we've created. So, for example, this is the directory that we've created. Now we've got the same directory listed here on this line. If we decide to change that, we're going to have to grep through everything to figure out where all did we define this path. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say I'm going to create a new variable called telegraph config directory. And then I'm gonna come up here to the top on my playbook definitions. I'm gonna create a var section. Create a telegraph config and define that as a variable. So now I can use that here. And then also in my Jinja template, I can use it here as well. So now another benefit of using the templating is that you can inject variables like this inside of here. But then you don't have to worry about changes. You know, next time if you change this directory, you'll change it everywhere, not just that spot. So I'm going to run it again. This time it should execute because the file exists.
And while that's running, Brett, we had a question in the chat.
Sure.
Since you provided a custom system D config, this wouldn't work with other config systems, right?
Correct. Yes. So I'm not going to get to how you do that today. I've done this before at DigitalOcean, where we had to deal with CentOS, Fedora, Ubuntu, basically the whole list of Linux systems. What you're going to end up doing in those situations is these things that are not specific like this, you can leave here. Now, when you're copying the files like this one, what you're going to do is you can change the way that this works. You can do this so this is like, what is it, Ansible? I don't remember what the exact variable is, but it's something like Ansible Linux. Anyway, version. I'm just going to say version. That's not what it is. Equals like, is it like Debian or something like that? And then you can just assume that it's systemd, or you can say, is it systemd? There are other variables that are part of the fact cache. A lot of those variables I talked about before, so like the inventory on host web 1. Right, so yep, so you see in here your service manager. So what you're going to do inside of your code here is you're going to say Ansible Service Manager is systemd. So this is only going to execute if systemd is the one that's running on this machine. Now that's going to get kind of fuzzy in the code because now you're going to have two of these, one for systemd, one for or three or more, right? So generally what you do is you end up taking this out and you're going to pop it into a role or a separate playbook altogether that says add the service files for systemd. And then what that's going to look like is systemd telegraph service. So that's what it's going to look like inside of the code here once you change that. But for now, just to keep it brief, you're right that everything is specific to systemd just because that's what I'm working with. Looks like everything ran. I'm going to check to see. Actually, I'm going to do it this way. How is it with? What did I call it? Yeah. So I'm going to jump to the machine. You can do this from the Ansible command line, but it's a lot faster. You don't have to deal with paging. I'm just going to show an example here. Right. So I think this is because, oh yeah, so here's what happened here. You can see the telegraph is running and it's trying to write to localhost. This does not look like any of the configuration that we created. So what happened in this instance is telegraph has already been running. And it was already running when we dropped the config files, and it's not even looking at that. So when we said this instruction here, telegraph is started and enabled, it was already running and it was already enabled. So this task just said, sure. And we did not do a daemon reload on systemd. So even if we modified this file in Linux, it just assumes the old version of it. So this is kind of what I want to get back to when I start talking about the handlers. So another part of Ansible is you can create arbitrary handlers. Now a handler in its normal sense is literally just another task. So in this case, we're going to say reload, or restart telegraph. Now this is no different than any other task we would write anywhere else, but the name is important. So I'm going to say service name telegraph state restarted. So this name is what's the important part here, because this name is how you're going to execute this handler throughout the code. So this is kind of part of the repeating part of this. So we want to restart the service if we change the this, because we have to restart it so it'll pick up the changes, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new instruction as part of our task and say notify restart service. What this notify does is if this task changes some kind of state, it triggers an event called restart service. That event is not going to get executed until the playbook is completed. So at the very end of the playbook, it's going to say, all right, what unique list of events were triggered in the order they were triggered, and I'm going to go back, I'm going to execute them in this order. I think it's the order that they're defined in the handlers list. So in this case, we want to restart it. We want to restart that in case that we change the telegraph config file. We also want to restart it if we change the output config. We want to restart it if we change the input config. So if any of those files change, we want to trigger a restart at the very end of the playbook. Just because I know this is coming, the telegraph service file, if you change that, another thing that you have to do is you have to notify systemd that your systemd configuration files have changed. If you're familiar with Linux, you already know this process. It's called systemd daemon reload. So this is the systemd part of it. I'm going to be specific to that. Say systemd daemon reload true. So when we change this file, we want to do more than just that. We actually want to change this to a list now of doing multiple. We want to do a daemon reload and a restart service in that order. So these files aren't going to change on disk. So I'm going to, because we've already executed them, if we run the playbook again, it's going to say nothing changed, so I didn't notify. So I'm actually going to manually just update this file so that it does have a change set. That way it'll notify the daemon reload and the restart service. Does all that make sense? I know that was kind of a lot. Any questions on that?
No questions.
Cool. So I'm going to run it again. We should get an update change because I changed the file. Oh, restart service. I didn't get it wrong today.
And then you had restart service and restart telegraph.
Yep, that's why. Actually, I'm going to do it the intelligent way. Call it restart telegraph. If we add another service, it's going to get really confusing. So the playbook failed, which means this did not apply, or no, it did apply. So I'm going to do this anyway. This should be coming towards the end. So you see here, daemon reload did not execute, but the restart telegraph did. So let's see what happened there. Yep. Looks like everything's running. It did the daemon reload the last time. I guess that's why I didn't do it this time. You can see it has loaded our config. Everything seems to be flushing just fine. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over to here, and then now we're going to see that all of our metrics are now being pushed to refine. You'll see them start showing up here in a second. Let me change this to 15 minutes. But you can kind of see the disk usage has been updated and the uptime. We'll start seeing CPU metrics and everything else. So that's that. I can go through, I know we're kind of running short on time here, but I can show an example of, we can update the vagrant file. I won't go through that, but you can add another server essentially. So if I go down to my vagrant file, I actually change this. So if I were to add like a 5 and then run it again, everything would be the same. So if we deploy 15 more servers, we're going to come back here. We're going to want to run telegraph agent. We're going to run the same command again. And we're going to know that it's going to run on every server. Now, another option we have is, let's say you run this. Oops, I'm sorry. Let's say you run this and let's say you have 100 and some odd servers and you're like, well, I know everything's in a good state. I just applied them. But we have another server that I forgot, so I want to run it on that one. So you can actually limit it to web 1. Say, I just want to run on just that one thing inside of the inventory. So it's going to limit the group to just that one in the inventory. There we go. Now we have metrics. So they'll start showing up over time as Telegraph pushes them through. But that's the end of that part of the demo. Got a couple more slides and we should be done. So as far as next, Ansible Galaxy is something I did not cover. What this has is Ansible Galaxies where people upload playbooks. If you're ever on this website, you're going to see Gearling Guy everywhere. The guy has created like 100 and some odd of the most used playbooks on Ansible Galaxy. And what they do for you, for example, is this will give you Docker. And then what that enables you to do is inside of your Docker, if you want to install Docker, you don't have to write everything I just did. So for example, we have all of this code here that I wrote. And it's very specific to what I'm doing. So if we wanted to do Docker YAML, this is actually going to be as simple as once we pull down that Ansible Galaxy servers, roles, Gearling Guy, that's the entire playbook. So sticking this guy's role onto a web server. Now I've used this Docker one several times, so I can confirm its validity. It'll install Docker on those machines. And you can run it over and over again and everything works fine. Here's an example of what that looks like. You have some configuration options you can apply with that role. So you can say like Docker compose false. So that role, oops, I'm sorry. That role will install, and one of the token variables that it has in that role is Docker compose. Do you want it to install it or not? So you can say false. That will just change the values there. The modules. There are a ton of modules for Ansible. I've covered like 4 or 5. I've used 100 or so, and there are probably hundreds and hundreds online that you can go through. I mean, there's some of the most, specific things you can think of where you'll start to write it in Ansible and you think, wonder if there's a module. And sure enough, there's a module and you give it 2 or 3 flags and it does everything you were about to do manually in Ansible yourself. And it's much more clear and concise. And then the Jinja 2 template, I would say look at that because this is one of the most powerful templating languages I've used. You have basically the whole Python SDK available with this. You can run through a ton of different things. You can execute a bunch of different stuff like lists, zip, pick things out of lists, turn to dictionary, stuff like that. So just to give an example of a real example that I have that I use at home with Jinja is I have 2 AdGuard servers that I use for DNS management for like family protection and stuff at home. In my inventory file, I have the AdGuard servers defined, their IP addresses, and then I have my dev box. I'm just going to use as the example here, which is just localhost. The thing that I'm trying to create out of this is I want my AdGuard DNS servers to be in a DNS mask configuration on my dev box. So these IP addresses depend on the inventory itself. So what I do here is I want to take the inventory's IP addresses and I want to inject them into the playbook itself. So I'm going to be applying to the local host, but I'm going to use other inventory's information to apply specifically to that. And so this is a playbook that I have for my personal setup. I created a variable called DNS servers. I look at the group variables called AdGuard. That's going to give me a list of JSON blobs, which has all of the facts about those servers that exist in this AdGuard. And what I'm trying to get to is this IP address. So I'm going to pipe it to a mapped extract. I'm going to look at its host vars, and I want, as you see on the right, Ansible default IPv4 address. So I'm going to take that out, Ansible default IPv4 address, and I'm going to basically turn DNS servers variable into a list of servers, a list of IP addresses. I could have done the same thing on default gateway. I just didn't here just because I wanted to keep it concise. And then the playbook's pretty straightforward. I want to copy to this DNS mask file. I'm going to give it the mode 0644. And then I'm going to use the Jinja templating to loop over my DNS server's list, which is just a string list of IP addresses, and then print out server equals IP for every DNS in that. And what that's going to come out to is what you see on the top right, the server equals 192.168.2.151 and 152. So that's a real example of how I use it at home. That's some of the power of that you can use in Jinja. Now, that's great for doing things at home, but what about like the real world? So I have used Ansible on pretty large scale systems. For example, at DigitalOcean, we built the metric platform that is used by all of the public facing machines at DigitalOcean. So if you've ever created any kind of machines or Kubernetes clusters or anything like that, you get a metrics platform with that. And that's actually managed by both Terraform and Ansible that I wrote while I was there from end to end with my team. That was all created with Ansible. What that cluster is, it's 35 machines. They're created with Terraform. They run Prometheus, Thanos. Some of them have Kafka, or they interact with Kafka. They use a hash ring for high availability and a bunch of other things. And it's all right there in the Ansible playbooks that we created and committed to GitHub. That system handles about 3 million metrics per second. And we can run those playbooks very confidently without messing any of that up, because we have all of those instructions in Ansible, and we know specifically what they're going to do, and it's only going to apply what we expect it to. And all of that stuff, like I said, created inside of Ansible. Here's some links that you can read more about some of the stuff. The Ansible docs, like I said, are fantastic. I covered those earlier. They have a module for everything. They have examples, which is extremely useful. Sometimes the variable definitions themselves don't tell you everything, so the examples will pretty much give you what you're looking for. And then Ansible Galaxy, talked about that, and then the testing, and that's pretty much it. Any questions?
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one.
I don't exactly have a question, but you remember earlier when I said, yeah, I started off using Ansible and then went to Terraform. Well, this kind of confirms for me, yeah, I made the right choice. I mean, not that I don't like this. What I mean is this definitely wasn't where I needed to be.
Yeah.
And so yeah, because like I have 11 EC2 instances out of my 4 accounts that I have like 4,000 ECS services running. So it's a totally different use case. So totally.
Yeah. Like I said, it's the infrastructure we created at DigitalOcean. It's still used today. I'm still close with the people that are on that team. We use Terraform explicitly for creating and managing the machines in the infrastructure, and then we use Ansible for applying everything that we want to that infrastructure. So that's what turns it from a fresh install. I would say Ansible is what turns it from a fresh installed operating system into what you want it to be, if that's what you're looking to do.
That totally 100% makes sense. And of course, again, I'm not really doing any of that. I'm just deploying Docker images. So
yeah,
makes total sense.
Here's another one that I use pretty often. You can define a Docker container as an Ansible task. There's a ton of variables. It looks like what you would get from a Docker compose, obviously, but you kind of keep it in with the rest of your stuff. So basically, you're going to define it the same way you would, and then you know for sure this container is running. And I want to say that one of those things that we ran at DigitalOcean was a Docker container on that. I can't remember what it was though. And then, so Justin, you asked earlier about the state. You just have it. If you have a name, you can put state absent, and I'll just delete the container named this.
Gotcha.
So you'll definitely see, looking through the docs, that there's an overlap. Like I said before, there is definitely overlap between Ansible and Terraform. But I usually, like I said, that overlapping area I just stay out of, and I'm like, I'll just use this part of it and this part of it for what it's used for. And the cool thing is, it's like part of Terraform is you have provisioning steps, and in the provisioning steps you can say provision with Ansible. So you can write all of your Ansible scripts, and then in your Terraform file you can say, create, count 15 machines, define your networking and everything. And in the provisioning step, you can say provision with Ansible this playbook. And Terraform will actually execute Ansible as a part of that.
That's
Any other
great.
questions?
I don't think so. Seems like a lot of silence here. David, do we have a speaker lined up for next month?
So I'm not sure. I thought that we did, but we'll make sure that we flush that out here in the next week or so.
Okay.
Well, Brett, you know what? Put up your Twitter handle or something else like that, or if you want folks to be able to contact you about anything too. I think you had it on like your first slide or something like that, but or put it in the chat or whatever, that would probably be fine.
Sure.
Really appreciate you coming out, Brett, this month, and it's really interesting chat talk here. And unless anyone else has anything, I'll keep this up for another minute or so, and we'll just say thanks for coming this month, and really appreciate it. And would love to have you come back again sometime, Brett.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna push the code to GitHub once I clean out some of the stuff, and then I'll be able to share it this month.
Oh, and
Yes, I'll share that.
I was going to ask about that, and then also comment that Russell has the meeting recording, and we'll see what we can do to get it up on our YouTube channel as soon as we can.
Cool.
Yeah. Did you already copy it, Russell? All right, cool. All right. Well, I guess from that, thank you everybody, and have a great night. Stay warm tomorrow, and have a good one.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks.